Hi there. In the first session, I showed you how to create the Yape container and how to run it on your system. Now what we're going to do is something a little bit more interesting. If we scroll down through the GitHub page near the bottom, you'll see an example of doing a weekly graph or weekly charts from the data you have. One of the great things that Fabian did when he did this second version of Yape was to instead of just processing the data straight out of the pButtons file and into charts, he loaded it into an intermediate SQLite database. This is just for a very lightweight database and a convenient way of storing the data so it can be processed in different ways. Now, if you take no particular options, the database will just be in memory and will disappear once the the Yape is finished running. But if you use the file DB option, which I'll show you in a second, what it does is it actually persists the database, and you can do quite a few interesting things with that then. And I'll walk you through a couple of those. One of them is to to accumulate your data for a week perhaps, and then do a weekly graph. And that's what I'm going to show you in this example. So here we go. What I've got is a folder here with 7 HTML files, so a week's worth of data. What I'm going to do is just hop across to our terminal window, and I'm in that same window. And if I use the file DB option, so I've got a for loop here that's just going to loop through each of the HTML files, and then we're going to do our Docker run command for Yape that we looked at in the first session. This time we've got a file DB option, and what that just says is output, instead of creating that SQLite database in memory and getting rid of it after the Yape finishes running, actually persisted on disk. And because we're looping through, we're actually going to accumulate all the data from all of these files into this database, and we'll do a couple of interesting things with that. So I'll kick that off, and that will take a little while to run, especially on my laptop. So it's just going to crunch through those files, and I'm just going to pause the video and we'll come back once it's finished that. So as this keeps crunching through, I'll point out a couple of things. So I've used, as I said, the file DB option, but you can notice I haven't specified like --mgstat or --iostat. So I'm not actually plotting anything. All I'm doing is actually the first step, which is passing the pButtons files and accumulating the data. Okay, so that's finished running through. If I do an ls in this directory, we can see that we've got our HTML files, and there's one extra file, this one called my example SQLite. Remember, we named that as our output database file. I didn't put any options on here to actually produce any plots or anything. We'll do that as a second step. And you could process a week and put that in a file, or you could just process a day. It doesn't really matter. The one thing to remember is if you keep using the same name, they do accumulate. So let's hop across to Finder, and we can see that here's our extra file here, my SQLite file. If I double click, it'll open a little freeware utility that I use, which is really handy, this DB browser for SQLite. Let's see, let's go to website. So if we quickly have a look at the website, just so you know, it's a freeware tool, and it's excellent. So I'll just put that away. And so this database that we're using to create the plots has broken the pButtons file down into all its component parts. For example, there's iostat and vmstat. If you were using Windows, you'd see Windows perfmon here. So all the columns and everything. yeah, we can actually browse the data. So if I went and had a look at VMstat, for example, we can see, you know, we've got date and time, and then run queue, idle, wait, and so on. You can even do some very rudimentary plotting from here. You know, we could plot the run queue, for example. Oops. What I'm using this tool for, though, is at the moment just to show you what we have and what we're going to be working off as an intermediary. And so this database now is sitting around, and we can use it for all sorts of interesting things. So let's actually go and plot some data from that database. Here we go. Let me cut and paste again. So I'm going to just run the command that you saw before, mgstat vmstat. I'm doing quiet mode, but this time I'm specifying the database file. Here's my example, .SQLite, and this parameter here, skip past, says don't bother going through and processing the pButtons file because we've actually done that already, so we can ignore that step. I can also specify an output file. So if I say data, just stats, for example, it will start to create all my plots for me. Because I put the quiet mode on, it's not putting out much on the terminal screen, but if I go here, we can see my folder stats, which I named here, -o, and it'll start to be populated soon with the files, the plot files. You can see, well, you can't see, but my CPU, and you may be able to hear my fan in the background grinding away as all this data is processed. So we'll pop back here in a few seconds. Okay, so the plots are starting to come out now, so let's just have a look at the GlowRefs one. And so we can see now, because I had processed a week, that we've got a week's data in there. You know, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We can see that this particular machine that was running, you know, Sunday was a quiet day, which is not a surprise. So here's all the mgstat stuff, and I asked for vmstat as well, so that'll start to populate in a minute as well. Okay, so that's finished. We can see that the vmstat is there for the week as well. I'll look at the run queue again. Okay, so that's all good. The SQLite database is still there, so we can still do a few more interesting things. One of the other useful things we can do is, if I go back to the Yape page, we can see that there is also a time frame flag here. If I go up to the help menu, we can see that we can add in you know, mgstat and plot vmstat and so on. We've used the file db, but there's this time frame flag here. So what we can do is, now we've got our SQLite database sitting there, we can make use of that and not have to keep reprocessing the data all the time. So what I'm going to do is go through, and I noticed that on the 20th there was a big spike in reads for some reason, so I'm going to just paste in this command. So we're going to do run and run Yape. We're just going to look at mgstat. We're going to use our SQLite database, and we're going to skip over passing the data so we don't have to overwrite it, but we're just going to extract a section of the data between the 20th at 15:30 and 16:30, and we're going to output this time to a different directory, just to make it easier on ourselves when we're looking at this. You can get a lot of files pretty quickly doing this. So that's going to go there. We'll just hop across here. So if I see a new directory has been created, and what Yape is doing now is just doing a query on that SQLite database, and it's just going to plot that time frame. So we can see that the data is coming out, and helpfully Yape puts the date and time in there. So if we look at the glow refs, now we've got a much shorter time period. The charts can often a lot more interesting. We were looking at the physical reads between that time, and yes, there definitely was a big spike in reads for whatever reason. Not surprisingly, the read ratio dropped through the floor. And what else was going on? What were the writes doing? Yep, a lot of writes, and probably doing a fair few updates. So something's going on. Anyway, that's a way of zooming in and looking closely at the system. Okay, and here's the last command I'm going to show in this session. One of the more tricky commands to extract, just simply cutting and pasting, which is the old way of getting data out of pButtons, was iostat. It's a real mess, and it can be quite different between systems. So this command here, which I've just run, is once again, you can see I've dropped off. We're not doing mgstat anymore. Still using our SQLite database, still within the same time frame, but this time I'm selecting iostat to plot, and also selecting the option to only pick one disk, DM-5, and I'm going to put the output into this guy here, iostat, so another folder. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that if we go back up to our earlier example where we on this system, I don't know how many that is, like 10 or 15 disks in total. Using LVM though, I happen to know that DM5 is the database disk. So instead of plotting out all of those, and a lot of that data is not going to be useful to me right now, I'm just choosing to plot out just one disk, DM5, and I put it into its own folder, iostat, just to keep things nice and tidy and keep my sanity as I try and work with this data. And we can see that it's done the same thing. We selected a certain time frame. If we had no time frame, it would just do the whole 7 days. And then I can go and have a look, and remember we were having a look at, well, here's the reads, and here's actually what was going on the database disk. We can see here the await, or the latency on those disks, was generally pretty good. A few spikes there that we might want to have a look at later. But this is a way of zooming down and looking at your disk activity as well. So just like all the other commands that are in there, you can do the same for SAR and various other things. So that's it for now. I'll wrap this up in a community post. So if you go to community.intersystems.com, and if you search for Yape, you'll come across the articles that these